A moment or two here to talk about a new book that's out this spring that will interest many folks. It's called Back to the Futures. That's plural. Back to the Futures. Crashing dirt bikes, chasing cows, unraveling the mysteries of the commodity futures markets. University of Illinois agriculture economist Scott Irwin is here to talk about his new book. Now, you had a little bit of help in writing it. Is that correct, Scott?
That's correct. I had a good friend named Doug Peterson, who was my co-writer of the book. And to the degree that it really reads well, he deserves much of the credit.
It does read well. It's an easy read. You explain economic concepts in the book, but you talk about your youth growing up on the farm. And one thing that occurred to me is your book is a wonderful tribute to your farmer father. He was an interesting character in many ways like other Iowa farmers, but he had an interesting hobby. He loved to drive things fast, and you developed somewhat of a risk-taking posture as his offspring, I gather, by reading the book.
Yeah, I suppose it was something of an inherited trait and then a learned behavior watching my father drive his hopped-up, souped-up pickups as fast as he did. I like to say, Max, that I grew up in an Iowa farm family that was obsessed with two things, the grain markets and going fast.
You talk about your early developed interest in the grain market, and that was at the local grain elevator, and man, that hit close to home for me. As I would ride the elevator, go into the elevator with Dad in the truck, and when we crossed the scales, I would hop off, go into the office where the Garrett brothers, Dink and Booge Garrett, would sit in there, the guys who ran the elevator, and farmers would be loafing in there. I'd get my 10-cent bottle of Coca-Cola and try to down that by the time Dad came back across the scales empty. But I would watch the prices posted there. I would watch the ticker in that office, and that's where you developed, if I understand correctly, such an interest in these markets.
Absolutely. We are kindred souls in that regard, Max. I had exactly that same kind of experience that you so beautifully describe, and it just hooked me for some reason. And I really got interested in the markets when I was in high school in that huge early to mid 70s run up in grain prices. And it was just an incredible time to get interested in the markets. And I got started and never stopped.
I was a student at Purdue University by that time, where there were some noted agriculture economists, and in fact, part of your education was spent there at Purdue. But your early years in education were there, of course, in Iowa on that farm. And then I believe you were a student at Iowa State University. But one thing that occurred to me is how you were willing to take risks along the way, not without dangers. Elaborate.
Well, a lot of those risks early in my life were not very well considered risks. Just like I said, we like to drive cars really fast and do crazy things, and there were all sorts of stunts, episodes, pranks, and some of those are described at length in the book.
And some of those took you right to the edge. You were in danger in some instances there. You know, one thing that occurred to me is you were racing cars in a rural area of Iowa. How did you not come under the scrutiny of the local lawmen? I mean, when we ran cars a little bit fast in southern Indiana, the town marshal knew about it, the county sheriff knew about it. You guys seemed to escape the long arm of the law.
That's a good question. We had county sheriffs, and they had a much looser, I think, view of enforcing the traffic laws than they do today. And that's probably a good thing. So it was a relatively unpopulated area. That was one thing. And probably, quite frankly, we were just lucky that none of us were thrown in jail for what we did and how fast we were driving and the kind of stunts that we pulled.
But you were willing to take risks later on, too, as a student, and that involved the futures markets. And, you know, I never did do that. I was reporting on the markets in Chicago. I started off as a young man of 24, and there was that opportunity to become a speculator. I was scared to death. I did not have that risk-taking attitude. I grew up the son of the Depression. We didn't have much. I knew I could lose what little that I had. Plus, I was afraid of the CFTC, to be honest with you, to be talking the market on the radio and to wind up talking my position. I thought there might be a knock on the door. But you got into the futures markets, you took the risk, and it was a little bit scary, was it not?
Oh, absolutely. My first major episode of speculation, I almost traded my way out of graduate school at Purdue University, which would have been a disaster in my life. I can't believe I ended up risking all, and I did. I spent the first summer while I was in graduate school basically just speculating in the corn and soybean markets. And after the August 1981 crop report, which I got exactly wrong in the corn market, I lost all my money and came really close to accumulating massive debts that I would have had to pay off by getting a job and leaving grad school. I came literally this close to that happening.
As you pointed out in your book, you were watching a very small part of what was going on the weather scene in the United States Corn Belt. And you address this in the book. I've often said that a terrible way to market your crop is by looking out your office window or your kitchen window. Elaborate on that a bit, if you would.
Well, I think that that's one of the things that's extremely hard for farmers to do, is to not overweight the information that they do have. They're experts in the information about the potential of their crops. They know that area, but there's a tendency to want to generalize that to the entire Corn Belt. It's a psychological bias that everybody has to fight. It's called looking out your back door. And my episode where I lost all my money was a classic episode of doing that. I'd gone home on a trip back to see my dad and family shortly before the crop report, and I listened to all the local farmers and in the grain elevator coffee shop complaining about what they thought were going to be their poor crop prospects. And I thought I had inside information, and it was just the opposite of that, Max. And I learned a hard lesson.
The characters in the futures markets, the names, and you write about them extensively. Leo Melamed, you write about Terry Duffy, who is continuing to play a role, of course, in CME and has for a long time. I don't think you mentioned Jack Sander, did you? He was a boxer, but it speaks to the fact that some of these guys it was very combative in the pits. In fact, were there not some firms that hired football players because they could hold their positions on the steps?
Oh, absolutely. It was a very physical and physically demanding job. And so you can imagine athletes of all kinds of stripes. There was a fairly large contingent, especially at the CBOT, that were ex-cops. All people who knew how to handle themselves physically had an advantage in the pits.
Many of us remember that first trip down to the floor and how impressed we were. And stepping out of the corn pit when I was there, that very first day was a guy by the name of Kenny Gorgel, who had played football at Purdue. He played football, I think, for a brief time for both the Bears and the Packers. And he was a corn trader. And I remember looking up to him when he stepped out. Max, it's nice to meet you. But it was guys like that who were locals. They may have been working for a big firm, for commercials. A lot of interesting backgrounds, were there not, in these people who were there trading the markets and often demonized by farmers as crooks.
Right, and they did have a lot of different colorful backgrounds. I like the way that Terry Duffy describes himself in the book. He's about, I think, my height, about 6'3", 6'4", and so just like in basketball, it's an advantage being tall, so you can see over everyone, and so those kind of people tended to populate the pits, but more so just to survive that kind of daily grind of being in that physical melee for 4 hours a day. You just had to be kind of a different, colorful personality, and so those were attracted, I think, to the adrenaline rush that was the pits every day.
I guess it took its toll in many instances. Most of those guys you had talked to were a horse, and I think, yeah, many of them had ulcers, and many of them had stories of fortunes won and lost, and marriages wrecked along the way too, as you point out, quite colorful. You make a real good point in your book about educators who gave you some slack, and it affected you as you have educated students. Talk a little bit about that, the way it impressed you, the way they had handled you.
Well, twice in particular as an undergraduate at Iowa State, I was given a grace that I did not deserve at all. One incident, highly embarrassed to the university at a international conference where my friends and I chose to float around the lake in front of the Union with a fake iceberg, and that was a I probably did deserve to be expelled for what we did, and the dean of students was a giant of a figure on campus named Lewis Thompson. Certainly got his piece of hide, but then actually it was the first time someone suggested, you kind of said, Erwin, you're too smart for these stunts. Why don't you think about graduate school? And you can imagine being 19 years old, that was like, what? But I listened, and it did have an impact. And then I didn't quite get the message completely. And then when I was a senior, I skipped town for a period of my last quarter and almost failed a required course. And the professor gave me a break on the final, which I've never forgotten. And to this day, over 40 years later, if there's a graduating senior in my classes, was first at Ohio State, now at University of Illinois, I will do whatever I can to help drag them across the finish line to try to pay that professor forward.
Back to your family for just a moment as we wrap up here. Your father passed a few years ago. Am I correct that your mom is still around there on the farm, still watching crops, still paying attention to the values of those crops with a great economic appreciation?
Well, it's been fascinating. My dad passed away in 2009, and so the management and marketing of our farms in Iowa fell to my mom and I. And she's going to be 88 in a few days and sharp as a tack. And we do the marketing together. It's a real partnership. I kind of do the analysis. But as you know, Max, some people just have kind of a canny instinct for when to pull the trigger. And I give my mom a lot of credit. She's still got a great instinct.
There are a lot of names that pop up in your book that folks will find familiar. John Kenzenbaugh, for example, Richard Brock, and a list of others. I highly recommend the book, Scott, and I congratulate you on such a wonderful compilation, not just autobiography that is extremely interesting, but an educational text as well. Back to the Futures. Hope you have great success with it, sir.
I thank you very much and appreciate the conversation.
Scott Erwin of the University of Illinois joining us here for the visit.